Hello, everyone. My name is Claire McFarland, and it's my job today to welcome you to this webinar on behalf of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. I am not from the Academy, but I am one of the co-conveners for this webinar series. And this particular webinar is on space diplomacy law and regulation. In a moment, I'm going to hand over to Roy McLeod. But before I do that, I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands in which we're meeting on today. I am coming to you from Camaragal land, which is part of Sydney. And I know the panelists are from a whole range of different places, and I'm sure that they will let you know as we get underway. We do have a video from the Academy that we can play now.
Wherever you are across Australia,
we acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of this land.
The Darug peoples,
the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation,
the Gundungurra people of the Southern Highlands,
the Ngunnawal people of the Canberra region on whose country we are standing,
and all other peoples of this vast continent.
Their ongoing connection through custodianship of its land and waters,
physical and spiritual,
through culture, language and ceremony.
Where sovereignty was never ceded, we pay our respects to elders past, present and still to come.
So now I'm going to hand over to Professor Roy McLeod, who is my co-convener in this webinar series, and he's going to make some opening remarks. Over to you, Roy.
Thank you very much. Greetings from me too this afternoon, also from the Camaragal country, although from Neutral Bay, a little farther away from Clare, to speak to the purposes of our webinar series on Australia's future in space, an emerging agenda for the social sciences. As Claire has said, my name is Roy McLeod. I'm a historian of science and an emeritus professor of modern history at Sydney University, and sometime Charles Lindbergh Professor of Aerospace History at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. And as one born in the Kennedy generation who has lived with space for most of his life, from Gemini to Apollo and beyond, I want to share with you this afternoon my interests and passion in this adventure, and my concern for some dimensions of its future direction. As I've said before in earlier sessions, it is possible to say that to launch a series of this kind at this time, the time of the worst pandemic in a century, is perhaps not the best idea. But it's important, I think, that we do this because for many of us, we realize that space is already a given. During the last 2 years, few of us will have missed the rapid series of space-related events taking place around the world. In 2019, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the lunar landing. In 2020, the International Space Station celebrated its 20th anniversary. And this year alone, there have been no fewer than 11 significant space missions. In March, we saw the success of SpaceX in space and news of NASA's commercial payload services. And we're about to see the launch of the James Webb Telescope, perhaps the greatest adventure so far, overtaking Hubble in its technology and in the message it's going to bring us all. All these, of course, are the work of science and technology on a grand and noble scale, but we've also seen the arrival of new forms of human endeavor in the shape of space tourism, most notably, perhaps most visibly, conspicuously, led off by Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson, soon to be followed by Elon Musk, I'm sure. Space has become a very human enterprise, replete with human stories of competition, controversy, and potential conflict. Many see in this a danger of our not meeting our first principles and obligations, and seeing our possibilities being rushed by commercialization and militarization, raising questions about the ethics and behavior that should frame our presence in space. Meanwhile, of course, the hard work of space diplomacy proceeds apace. Nations have long debated and attempted to improve upon the 1967 Outer Space Agreement. And of course, last year we saw the arrival of the Artemis Accords, which so far 12 countries have become signatory, in hopes of, in NASA's words, creating a safe and transparent environment that facilitates exploration, science, and commercial activities for all of humanity to enjoy. Well, all of this comes upon us as social scientists to think much more closely about the human aspects of space exploration, as well as commercial development, looking into considerations of safety and security and settlement. Indeed, the question arises, how are we to conduct ourselves and behave towards the new environments that we encounter? How will our interaction with space, inevitably driven by a few, come eventually to benefit the many? All such questions force us to reflect upon the role the social sciences ought to play, hand in hand with the natural sciences and technologies that have so far dominated the scene. In this act of reflection, I believe it's also time to fashion a special focus on Australia and on Australia's present and potential participation in the space enterprise. As historians such as Kerry Doherty and others have recorded, Australia actually has a long history of engagement with space. And since 2018, we have our own space agency with potential and promise. And we hope this will open new frontiers for many. We have excellent media coverage and several centers devoted to space law and strategy and defense. But we lack in the social sciences something of a commitment and a mission. To my mind, we must ask even more fundamental questions than having been asked before, not only about the how of getting to space, but also about the whether and the why, and in what ways, to what ends, and with what consequences. We must question in whose interest do we, as Australians, venture first to the moon, then to Mars and beyond. Well, it's to this sort of questions that the series has been devoted. We are so far, in the seventh of what will be ultimately 9 sessions. The moderators of which have chosen teams to draw upon their own academic discourses in culture, history, health, heritage, law, diplomacy, industry, to deal with some of the practicalities of being there as well as getting there. And to conclude the series next week, we've asked 2 generations of younger Australians, recent graduates, and some still in school, to join us and to reflect upon their own hopes and ambitions for the spacefaring future. We'll hope you enjoy this session, as I hope you've enjoyed some of the rest of the sessions in the series, and will participate in our conversation. As you know, we are open to questions through the chat facility. All sessions have been and will be recorded and made available for later viewing. Warm acknowledgements go to all the members of all our teams and to the many who've helped us in these difficult times. At the moment, let me just begin by thanking Chris Hatherley, who is unfortunately unable to be with us this afternoon. But he is the CEO of the Academy of the Social Sciences and has been the backbone of our enterprise. And also thanks to my colleagues in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at Sydney University, and to our guides, Jose Torrealba and Jacob Craig, and most especially my colleague, whom you know, Ms. Claire McFarlane, for getting us all safely underway. with that, let me pass the floor back to you, Claire. Thank you.
Thank you, Roy. Thank you for that. Now, as we get underway, I want to introduce you all to Annie Handmer, who is the moderator for this session on diplomacy, law and regulation. And she's going to take it from here, and I will just close at the end. So Annie, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today. This is a session that we're all really looking forward to. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Claire, and to Professor McLeod for your kind introduction to this panel. I'm your moderator, Annie Handmer, and today I'm joining from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And in this session, as discussed, we will be talking about space diplomacy, law and regulation. Today's discussion is actually quite grounded in the lands on which we meet, because when we look down at Earth from space, there are no national borders. But nonetheless, national interest has come to define much of our past and present activities when we're looking up at space from Earth. Diplomacy, the process by which states negotiate and decide how they work together. Law, international and domestic, which defines principles and encodes rights and obligations. And regulation, the procedures and processes by which we give effect to those laws, are all important aspects to consider. And for Australia, the ways in which we navigate diplomacy, law and regulation shape our national space activities, but they're also shaped by our national space activities. When it comes to the treaties that make up our international legal obligations, there's a nuanced and complex relationship between our past and our future. And that relationship is mediated in real ways by our present. Thus, the purpose of this panel is not simply to outline the parameters in which we operate, but also to interrogate that relationship between diplomacy and industry, law and strategy, regulation and ethics, and to situate our discussion in real issues that will come to define Australia's relationship to space and with other spacefaring nations in the years to come. And I'm joined today by three of Australia's foremost practitioners and thinkers in relation to this topic, and I'd like to thank them for making time for this discussion. First is Dr. Kate Storr. Kate is the Chancellor's postdoctoral research fellow in the law faculty at the University of Technology, Sydney. Her research addresses the relationship between property, territory, and jurisdiction in international law, with a focus on historical struggles for legal control over natural resources. Kate is an experienced legal researcher and lecturer with a professional background in government and corporate legal practice. She has held posts at Melbourne Law School and the Glasgow School of Law, and is a junior faculty member with the Institute of Global Law and Policy at Harvard Law School. Now, also on your screen is Gerard Oakes. Gerard is the acting director in the International Security and Space section at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, where he focuses on outer space policy issues, including space security and peaceful uses of outer space. Gerard manages DFAT's key space responsibilities: UN engagement on space issues, including through the General Assembly, the Conference on Disarmament, and the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, which you'll probably hear referred to as COPUOS. Multilateral and bilateral space-related agreements and commitments, and space issues that affect bilateral and regional relationships. And last but certainly not least, Professor Stephen Freeland. Stephen is Emeritus Professor of International Law at Western Sydney University and Professorial Fellow at Bond University. He also holds visiting or adjunct positions at various other universities and institutes in Copenhagen, Vienna, Toulouse, Hong Kong, Montreal, Kuala Lumpur, Vancouver, and London. He is a member of the Australian Space Agency Advisory Board and has been an advisor to various governments on issues related to national space legislative frameworks and policy. He has represented the Australian government at the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, UN COPUOS meetings, and in June 2021 was appointed by UN COPUOS as Vice Chair of a 5-year working group addressing issues related to exploration, exploitation, and utilisation of space resources. He's also been a visiting professorial fellow within the Appeals Chamber at the International Criminal Court and a special advisor to the Danish Foreign Ministry in matters related to the International Criminal Court. He's also co-principal of a specialized law firm, Azimuth Advisory, and a director of the International Institute of Space Law, a member of the Space Law Committee of the International Law Association, and a member of the Space Law and War Crimes Committees of the International Bar Association. So I think we can all agree that we are privileged to have 3 such high caliber speakers joining us today. So thank you. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Kate for some opening comments.
Thank you, Annie, and thank you also for the invitation to join this conversation. I'm really pleased to be here. I'm on Gadigal land, and I also pay my respect to Gadigal elders. So I'll start by saying that I'm not an expert in space law. I am a historian of international law. That history is now highly relevant to current diplomatic debates over space resource utilisation, but it's also relevant to broader issues of geopolitical security arising with increased activity in space. So coming from this perspective, the first point to make is that while the hard technologies driving increased activity in space are new, the fundamental legal issues being faced are not new, or at least are not as novel as they first appear. The challenge of whether and how to regulate extraterritorial activity is one of the foundational questions of international law, whether we're talking about the activity of states or of corporations, or more commonly, when it comes to resource exploitation, activity involving both state and corporate dimensions. As such, resisting the urge to regard contemporary challenges in space law and diplomacy as novel is really important, not only to avoid reinventing wheels, but also to avoid going down paths that have contributed to rather than mitigated international conflict in the past. So there's a lot to gain from placing contemporary challenges in historical context, both in the context of the longer history of extraterritorial expansion, but also in the more immediate historical context of 20th century debates in international space law. So I'll say something about the longer historical context and then make some observations about the more immediate historical context of debates from the late 1950s onward. So in terms of the longer history of extraterritorial expansion, taken broadly from the 16th century onward, there are perennial themes that have remained remarkably stable over time, even as they shift in expression. And all of those themes are now expressing themselves in current space law and diplomacy. The first theme is the relationship between the state and the corporation in extraterritorial activity. And at the domestic level, this includes debates over public subsidisation of corporate enterprise and of the subsequent risk of monopolisation and related issues of market competition. And at the international level, it includes diplomatic debate over state liability for corporate conduct and the emergence of trade-based geopolitical alliances. We're seeing all of these issues start to emerge around space law and policy. The second theme is the really unstable relationship between private property and sovereign territory when property rights created under domestic law are asserted over resources outside territorial jurisdiction, as has been done by the United States and others over the last 7 years or so. The legal question of whether such claims to property amounts in effect to a territorial claim that attempts to extract the benefit of resources while bypassing the international law of territorial acquisition and the obligations that come with that is a question that has come to a head at numerous pivotal moments in the history of international law. So the most famous of these moments is that of the Berlin Conference on the Congo in 1884, which attempted to rewrite the rules of engagement on both sovereign and corporate conduct outside sovereign territory. The third theme that I want to emphasise, which is usually prompted by these very pivotal moments in the development of international law, is the unsettled question of the nature of the authority, if any, competent to govern activity outside sovereign territorial jurisdiction. So the concept of territorial administration by international bodies was established in the aftermath of World War I, when the League of Nations mandate system was established to oversee occupied territories, the sovereignty of which was then contested, and the United Nations inherited that claim of oversight over internationalised areas in the 1940s, which are then renamed trust territories. So a question that is really fundamental to current debates in space law is whether the UN still has that claim to authority or alone has that claim to authority over areas with international status. So I'll just finish with a very quick observation about the more immediate historical context of 20th century space law. Although it seems really novel, the issue of how to regulate space resource utilisation was on the table in UN and diplomatic debates from the 1950s. And at the time, that issue was firmly associated with the broader question of geopolitical security. The question of whether the Antarctic, the seabed, and bodies in space could be claimed as sovereign territory under international law was debated really earnestly in the post-war period, as diplomats and international lawyers worried that allowing such territorial competition would undermine the geopolitical balance established in the wake of World War II. So the space treaty regime that we have, that was settled in the 1960s and 1970s, responded to that context, and it attempted to avert the potential for conflict through the prohibition on sovereign claims and military activity, the permission of peaceful purposes, and the declaration of space as the province of all mankind, later revised in the Moon Agreement as the common heritage of mankind. So we'll no doubt have more to say about all of that and the common heritage of mankind principle, but I'll finish up there in terms of my introductory comments.
Thanks so much, Kate, for that historical view. We'll now hand over to Gerard to provide some current geopolitical context and speak to what's happening today. Thanks, Gerard.
Thanks, Annie. I'm coming to you from Ngunnawal land. So again, I pass on my compliments to the traditional owners of the land. I guess I just want to pick up on Kate's where she finished off there, and that was talking about the context of the international treaties formatted from the 60s and through the late 70s. I think the last one was signed or finalised in early 1980s. As sort of the geopolitical context, I mean, this was at the height of the Cold War, and so these treaties were designed to reduce tensions. And so the question we face today, some 50 years on, is, are the treaties still fit for purpose? And so I guess where I want to focus my remarks today is just on some of the work that we've been doing around the legal framework or norms and principles that may not be binding, and just to cover off how we're trying to address current day tensions. So I think I'll start with the cliche just to set the scene, and you can all sing along with me. Space is an increasingly contested, congested, and competitive environment. Space technology is becoming cheaper to build, launch, and maintain, and more countries are becoming spacefaring nations. So just as on Earth, geopolitical tensions and competitions are playing out in space, and that is leading to the associated risks. We also know the global economy, civilian population, and most militaries are dependent on space systems. Satellite remote sensing, communications, and navigation systems enable real-time access to information necessary to connect people, operate a global economy, and respond to natural disasters, and also to support military operations. And Australia relies heavily on these space systems, including for our defence operations and capability. But these space-based capabilities are vulnerable, and space is increasingly seen as an important component of strategic competition and military advantage. So we've seen the US, China, Russia, and India have all developed anti-satellite capabilities, developed and tested. Russia continues to test such capabilities, most recently a direct ascent anti-satellite missile test last December. The US has also accused Russia of testing on-orbit anti-satellite weapons. And for its part, Russia is concerned about the US placing missile interceptors in space. So we've got a concerning and destabilising environment. In response, India, France, Japan have announced intent to develop their own counter-space capabilities. And like the US, both France and the UK have established space commands. And Australia will also soon establish its own space division, somewhat equivalent. So the consequences of miscalculation remain great. Even a small-scale use of kinetic weapons in the space environment is dire. At best, debris would render orbits useless for many years, and at worst, any actual or perceived threat to nuclear command, control, and warning capabilities would provoke very serious strategic risks. So, having painted that cheery picture, where does all that leave us? And what can Australia do about it? The 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper commits Australia to strengthening international rules and laws that apply to space, including military uses of space. It directs us to work with partners, particularly through multilateral fora such as the UN Committee on Peaceful Use of Outer Space and the Conference on Disarmament, to strengthen norms of responsible behaviour. The current legal regime, as mentioned, was all developed in the 60s and 70s. The 1967 Outer Space Treaty is the cornerstone of this legal regime. It prohibits the placement of weapons of mass destruction in outer space or on celestial bodies. However, there are no explicit bans on the deployment of conventional weapons in outer space, nor on ground-based anti-satellite weapons or high-energy lasers or activities that directly or indirectly create space debris. So over the last 10 plus years, Russia and China have been promoting a draft treaty called Prevention of the Placement of Weapons in Outer Space and the Threat or Use of Force Against Outer Space Objects. A real mouthful, so we refer to that as PPWT. In the proposal, states parties would commit to refrain from placing objects carrying any type of space weapon into orbit, installing weapons on celestial bodies, and threatening to use force against objects in outer space. Russia also has another initiative called the No First Placement, which it runs through an annual UN resolution where countries are asked to pledge not to be the first to place weapons in space. We have issues with both initiatives. They would provide limited comfort and could be counterproductive by allowing unfettered development of terrestrial and dual-use counter-space systems. While Australia is in favour of the prevention of an arms race in outer space, we do not support either of these initiatives. The draft treaty on banning weapons in outer space appears at least to be as much about strategic manoeuvring as meaningful arms control. And there are fundamental issues with both proposals. First, they fail to provide a workable definition of a space weapon. Second, they fail to provide a verification mechanism to determine whether weapons have been placed in space. And third, they fail to adequately address counter-space weapons on Earth. So, what have we done? Faced with this model that we couldn't agree with, we set about establishing a new approach. Australia's worked with a group of like-minded countries on developing an approach that promotes stability and security on multilateral space security. This approach was supported by over 150 countries in the adoption of a new UNGA resolution last year, Resolution 7536, on reducing space threats through norms, rules, and principles of responsible behaviours. This was the launch of an important new conversation to examine the security threats nations face in space and work towards a common understanding of the role and responsibility, the role that responsible behaviours can play to mitigate miscalculation about the behaviours of other states in space and on Earth. We argued that threats, or even the perception of a threat against space systems, contribute to geopolitical instability and insecurity. It is thus vital to reduce these threats by articulating and maintaining responsible behaviours in relation to space systems. A common understanding of what constitutes responsible and irresponsible behaviours will greatly assist in providing a framework to supplement existing international law and guidelines applicable to states in their access to and use of outer space. Such a framework could discourage irresponsible behaviours. Development and implementation of norms, rules, and principles for responsible behaviours to strengthen international security in relation to space would also facilitate certainty and stability necessary to encourage investment in and growth of the commercial sector. The next step of this process was a report of natural views compiled by the UN Secretary General. And on 3rd of May this year, DFAT submitted Australia's submission to that report. We offered 10 principles for reducing space threats through norms, rules, and principles of responsible behaviours. In our submission, we offered the following rubric for characterising actions or activities in space. We said responsible behaviour were actions or activities that are clearly communicated, avoid surprise, respect the safety and security of other actors and beneficiaries, contribute to stability or risk reduction, and avoid provocation of tensions. Inversely, irresponsible behaviours are any actions which do not meet the above expectations and or could deliberately or inadvertently create debris, require emergency manoeuvres to lower the risk of collision or otherwise threaten or interfere with the normal operation of space objects in peacetime. And so what were our 10 principles? Just the group of sort of 4 categories: the key principles, risk reduction principles, transparency and confidence building principles, and then final principle on how we might further progress this idea. The resolution noted the need for all states to work together to reduce threats and through the further development and implementation of norms, rules and principles of responsible behaviours, with the aim of maintaining a peaceful, safe, stable, secure and sustainable outer space environment. The intent of the resolution was to seek to moderate actions and enhance security and stability, not to legitimise weaponisation of space. And this is an important point as we manage the twin dilemmas of uncertain intent and dual use nature of many space objects, which cannot be achieved through prohibition measures alone. Next step. So on the 16th of August, the UK released an updated draft resolution for consideration at this year's first committee. The resolution seeks to establish an open-ended working group on norms, rules and principles of responsible behaviour in space. Its mandate will be to take stock of existing international frameworks governing state behaviour in space, to consider current and future threats and security risks to space systems and the behaviours that could be considered irresponsible, and to make recommendations on possible norms, rules and principles of responsible behaviour. So, assuming there are no nasty surprises with the resolution, there's still much work to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerard, for that overview. And finally, Stephen, I'll come to you for your opening comments in regards to current international legal discussions and the state of play.
Thank you, Annie, and thank you to the Society, to Roy, to Claire, to Chris for the kind invitation, and also thank you, Kate and Gerard, for your amazingly interesting and remarks. I'm on Gadigal land. When I give talks, I often wonder at the fact that the land where I am and where all of us are has been land that's been inhabited by our First Nations people for 65,000 years, which is an extraordinary thought. It's over 2,500 generations. You will see the symbol of the Australian Space Agency is a map of Australia based on Indigenous perspectives on space. And our Indigenous people, along with First Nations people around the world, are really, truly the world's first astronomers. And we have a lot to learn from their knowledge and their understanding of space in the way we move forward. And I think that will be reflected in some of the comments I want to make now. It's really interesting hearing both the historical context, so important, and also the comments from Gerard on the if you like, national security issues and global security issues about space. They're both incredibly important. However, I would also add some additional perspectives. Gerard quite rightly described space with as he said, the cliche that is often used, competitive, congested and contested. But there are many other C words that also apply to space. Space is cooperative and collaborative and commercial and a commons. And the point that I think should not be lost in the incredibly important points that have already been made is that space is incredibly multifaceted. And so there are many voices that need to be heard in the fashioning of global diplomacy about space. Of course, it's about the historical context and history. Of course, it's about national security and geopolitics. Of course, it's about legal frameworks, but it's also about science, and it's about commerce, and it's about culture, and it has very significant religious overtones. It's got very significant consequences for society, and indeed, it's imbued in humanity. The future of humanity is very much integrated with the way we deal with space, we reflect on space, we respect space. The other issue about space is it is ubiquitous. You and I, everybody listening, virtually everybody on the planet in different ways uses space technology every day, 20 or 30 or 40 times without even thinking about it. And it's not just the GPS in our phone. It's about weather forecasting. It's about disaster management. It's about financial transactions and navigation. It's a critical element in our infrastructure. It controls sewage systems, and it controls transport and navigation and so many other issues. So it's natural that we require governance frameworks, governance structures, and an oversight on a multilateral basis to look at the issues of space, notwithstanding, of course, that the terrestrial tensions that we have now also been translated to space. There's no doubt about that. And space is, of course, incredibly important from a military perspective as well. The mention has been made of COPOAS. Indeed, last night was the beginning of COPOAS's latest, its 64th session. COPOAS has met every year since the early 60s. It was established in the late 50s. Australia was a foundation member. Australia has been an excellent voice at COPOAS, although perhaps there's more that can be done, and all the work that Gerard is doing is reflecting how Australia can play an important role. COPOAS now has 99 countries. It's one of the larger UN groups, and it's growing exponentially, plus another 30 or so permanent observers. Many of them are intergovernmental agencies. Space is a global issue. You hear often comments at COPOAS meetings, not just by states in their national capacity, but also by groupings, by GRULAG, the Latin American and Caribbean countries, by the G77 plus China, and the like-minded countries that Gerard referred to as well. It's a highly diplomatic, intergovernmental process. It's highly political. Just last night, Gerard was there as well. There was a long debate right at the beginning about whether the DPRK could be admitted as an observer, and the politics, the terrestrial politics, really came to the fore there. But notwithstanding all of those challenges about space, notwithstanding the fact that COPOAS is a cumbersome sometimes process, it requires a consensus in terms of its decision making, which I think is a plus as well as a minus, because it therefore requires buy-in from everybody. Notwithstanding all of the issues, notwithstanding the fact that the technology has moved on so quickly and continues to do so, by and large, and this is a generalization, space has worked thus far, notwithstanding all of the challenges we have. And part of that, in fact, a very big part of that, is the governance structure we already have. So I would, and I think Gerard was also saying this, say that the treaty framework we have and the fundamental principles we have are very much fit for purpose, although not sufficient for purpose in terms of dealing with all of the specificities. But they have meant that we have worked. Just like the Geneva Conventions of 1949, even earlier, have worked and are so crucial for the conduct of armed conflict, notwithstanding technological developments. So the space treaties, the principles are as important as ever and will continue to do so. So COPOAS and this multilateral process relies on notions of safety, stability, and sustainability of space. All of those issues require global cooperation and multilateral understandings. They're tough discussions, but by and large, there's a common interest in the major spacefaring nations and indeed every country in the world to find some common ground. Because as Gerard quite rightly says, if things go awry, or as Kate said, if people start to develop colonialist ideas, then we move towards consequences that we just can't imagine, and space then becomes unsustainable. I know we're running out of time already, so I'll stop there, Annie, but I'm happy to talk further about the resources issues that will come up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. This is always the way we get talking, and then the next thing you know, we're like looking at the clock and thinking about how we'll fit it all into the hour we've been allocated. I think this is a sign that we need to have a longer discussion at another date. But just to kick us off into a more, I suppose, back and forth section, I want to start by looking at that topic of research exploitation and looking at a practical issue that's risen to prominence in the last few years. So we've heard that just recently, the UN COPUOS Legal Subcommittee has agreed to convene a 5-year working group to discuss legal questions pertaining to the exploration, exploitation, and utilisation of space resources, which will be co-chaired by none other than our own Stephen Freeland. And so the question comes up here. I mean, when we're talking about the governance infrastructure of space, this is really key. And Kate, I want to come to you first and ask, to what extent has current diplomatic discourse on this topic been foregrounded by historical discussions? And what role has Australia played in that past?
Sure, it's an important question. Thanks, Annie. So the issue of the status of the common heritage of mankind principle in international law and of the Moon Agreement that adopts it was always going to come to a head. That was inevitable. Most people here will know, but the common heritage principle attributes jurisdictional authority over space resources to an international regime and requires universal distribution of benefit of resource exploitation. The Moon Agreement requires signatories to establish such a regime when space resource exploitation is about to become feasible, hence its current contestation in the COPUOS. So contrary to some contemporary understandings, the common heritage principle was never broadly or unqualifiedly embraced. It was really a placeholder. It was a compromise that very few states were happy with at the time. Australia is sometimes held out as a champion of the common heritage principle because it signed both the Moon Agreement and the Law of the Sea Convention in 1984 and then 1994, which adopt the common heritage principle. But the history is a little bit more complicated than that. Australia accepted the common heritage principle in respect to seabed resources because it regarded its primary objective in UNCLOS negotiations of securing sovereign resource rights in the continental shelf to have been met, and saw signing on to the common heritage principle as a reasonable payoff for that aim being met. With respect to common heritage in space resources, a lot of people have scratched their heads as to how it was that Australia came to accede to the Moon Agreement in 1984, some years after the text was settled in 1979. It was an unpopular treaty. Neither the US nor the Soviet Union signed. The records of the Department of Foreign Affairs reveal an interesting story about how Australia came to sign the Moon Agreement. It actually had very little to do with the common heritage principle itself. The Hawke government regarded the Moon Agreement as a disarmament treaty and was attempting to deflect attention from its own contradictory policy position on increased uranium mining on the one hand and being against the proliferation of nuclear weapons on the other. So the common heritage principle in Australia have a somewhat complex history, which is a little counterintuitive. As a general point, the diplomatic records in the National Archives show that the Commonwealth's resourcing of international space diplomacy has been sporadic and inconsistent. And I think that is an issue that definitely plays out. I think it's improving now, but over time the history has shown that expertise has tended to be focused in individuals rather than the department, and that leaves officials having to catch up every time space law becomes contentious, I think all of those things are playing out now.
Thank you for those comments. Stephen, I'm going to come to you now and just ask, in the context of what we've heard from Kate about this history of Australia's involvement in this question, and also about a deeper, historically indivisible relationship between property and territory and geopolitics, to what extent do you think it's actually realistic to expect that diplomacy and international law can be used to effectively mediate and moderate the interests of states when it comes to space resources?
Great question. Thank you, Kate, also for your comments, which I completely agree with. I'm cautiously optimistic because in the end, it's in the common, as I've used this expression already, it's in the common interests of those that really have the desire to engage in this. It's in the common interests for there to be an understanding ultimately, because nobody really wants to engage in activity that will give rise to conflict in space on the basis of competing claims for resources. Of course, that's something that may possibly happen if there is irresponsible behaviour, but it's in the common interests of most countries to avoid that. It's interesting, if you look at the historical context, Kate's right about the Moon Agreement, but remember the Moon Agreement was actually agreed by consensus, the terms of it, by all of those countries, including the United States, including Russia, as it was then the Soviet Union. Of course, they decided not to ratify. Exactly the same problems we had with similar, not identical provisions in the Law of the Sea Treaty, UNCLOS, at the same time. So this was not just about space. It was not necessarily about, in my opinion at least, the common heritage, because if you read the Moon Treaty, it makes it clear that in the end, and states parties to the Moon Agreement have actually declared this. 8 countries made a statement in 2008, not Australia. 8 states parties to the Moon Agreement declared this. They say, well, common heritage, if you read the treaty, will be whatever we determine it to be at the time. So, you know, many people think the Moon Agreement is in fact an enabling, not a restrictive treaty. But anyway, that's in a sense not an argument for today. I'm confident, cautiously, that law and diplomacy will play an important part moving forward on the resources issue. I'm a bit more sceptical on some of the other, if you like, major challenges, because there are some other major challenges. But on the resources issue, because of this common interest, the word exploitation at Copperos was a dirty word. 6 or 7 years ago, I recall one delegation mentioning that word and then being chastised by 5 or 6 other countries saying, how dare you even mention that word in these hallowed halls? Now we've moved on to the point where everybody accepts that this is an activity that is of great interest. Of course, there are many technological challenges. There are now many initiatives on from civil society on a national basis, on a bilateral basis, on a minilateral basis. Roy and others have mentioned the Artemis Accords, for example. All of those are important inputs to a broader process. But what I have seen in my very privileged position of co-chairing these discussions and having bilateral discussions as well as multilateral discussions is there is generally a clear common understanding that we need to find a way forward that will allow this activity to continue in a way where there are, in Gerard's words, minimal risks. Now, that's not a guarantee that things can't go wrong, of course, but I think law has demonstrated already that it has the ability, at least in the sphere of space, to point towards emphasizing the common interests rather than the differences. I know for some that sounds, unseemingly optimistic, but for me it's realism, because in the end, the alternatives are, as Gerard said, that we could have with disputes, orbits being unusable, space being inaccessible. Who would suffer the most if that were to happen? We'd all suffer, but actually the major spacefaring countries would suffer the most. And so they have this common interest to push the envelope as far as they can, but not to cross certain lines. And I think with resources, there's going to be a lot of hard discussions. I'm hopeful. I mean, it's really up to the member states, but I'm hopeful. Thank you, Annie.
Thank you, Stephen. So I'm going to now let us talk about some of those major challenges. And one of those challenges is conflict and the question of military uses and peaceful uses of outer space. Gerard, to you next. In your opinion, do you think it makes sense, or is it even possible to draw a clean line between peaceful and military uses of space?
Thanks, Annie. Yeah, interesting question. Look, in some ways, it's illogical to even try. So space has been used by militaries since the dawn of the space age, and that continues. So you look at something like GPS, which was developed for military use, but now has enormous civilian benefits. So in a space-based conflict, you could imagine that disabling this capability might be an attractive option in order to disable targeting systems and interfere with navigation, particularly now when you have rival global navigation systems having been developed, meaning that GPS does not represent an own goal on your own capabilities. And so the same logic would apply for many dual-use space systems. So the same service satellite that can repair or extend the life of your satellite could just as easily disable or damage other satellites. There are other factors that blur the lines. So the question of debris concerns all space users. Space weapons worry many because of their debris creating potential. But when you think about that safety, sustainability and security of space, there's a nexus right in the middle there where debris sits, and it threatens all three. But in a multilateral context, it certainly helps to try and make that delineation. So one example is in the Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space. So they spent 10 years negotiating the long-term sustainability guidelines. And eventually they could only get that over the line when they agreed to drop 7 security-related contentious guidelines. And so once you strip the security aspects out of this, consensus was able to be achieved. And so this is, the flip side of that with the responsible behaviours work is that we're very deliberate in trying to make sure that that remains as a Geneva security conversation as opposed to a Vienna peaceful use of outer space conversation. Because when you do get this blurring, inevitably consensus gets much, much harder. So, bit of both, Annie.
That's a fairly honest response, and yeah, thanks for being candid about it. It is a massive challenge. Kate, I think we might make this the final kind of question, then we'll come around for some concluding remarks. But in what ways do you think that our collective insistence on trying to draw that kind of a line historically has helped or hindered us in managing our behaviour towards one another? Is this a line that we just can't help but attempt to assert? What happens if it's not there?
Oh, look, I think the thing to remember about that distinction is that it's not a natural fact. It's a historically created fact that was created in the late 1950s, particularly in relation to the Antarctic treaty system, but also referring to the broader Cold War context. I think that remembering that it is a historically constructed fact is enabling. The distinctions between the two are flexible. The designation of peaceful purposes as including both commercial activity and scientific exploration has always been really closely related to military activity. That distinction, I think it's useful to understand that the distinction is used to achieve particular objectives and that it can be used to achieve particular objectives. It's not natural, which means that it's flexible. I'm going quickly to try and meet the time requirements.
Thanks. Yeah. I feel like at some point I need to get a T-shirt printed that says it's all a social construction, just like everything else. But that doesn't mean that it isn't real. So I think on that note, I'm going to come around to each of you for your concluding remarks, if we can keep them brief. But also, I know there's been some really interesting discussion in the chat, and I'd like to thank all of the people who've attended for that discussion. I'm sure that our panelists will touch on some of it in their concluding remarks, and that which they don't touch on, you have my permission to send me a message through whatever means you find, and we can chat about it if you'd like to after the fact. So with that in mind, Kate, I'm going to throw back to you first on your concluding remarks. And what would you like to say to wrap up?
Sure, I'll be quick. I just want to thank you for including me in this conversation. I think that we're at a point where it's really important for debates around space law to include people from outside fields of space law expertise. There's a lot of engagement with the hard sciences and with the engineering side, but I think that including a historical and a legal perspective, but also, other areas of law and other disciplines at this point is really important, because I think that the stakes of these questions, as Stephen was saying, they're universal. We all have an interest in these matters, and there should be more general and informed public debate. And so I think more interdisciplinary engagement can only benefit that end. Thanks.
Thank you. Gerard?
Make sure I'm not muted. Look, I think I might just... basically my key message was geopolitical tensions on Earth are often played out in space. And to paraphrase ANU's Cassandra Steer, who eloquently put it, in an age of cross-domain warfare, the ability to target or compromise an adversary's system has raised tensions. And these tensions have led to changes in domestic space policies and strategies by all key states, to an escalatory cycle of developing counter space technologies, or a range of ways in which to target or interfere with each other's space-based assets. And so Australia, we're actively engaged in multilateral considerations of those issues, and that's primarily through the responsible behaviours work, but we still have much work to do. Thanks.
Thank you, Gerard. Stephen?
Thank you, and thank you again for including me as well. It's been a great discussion, albeit far too short, I think. Really, just following on from Gerard, Australia has a real opportunity, but I think also a responsibility to play an important role now. As a sophisticated spacefaring nation for many years, we understand space, we've been involved in space, we have wonderful interactions with like-minded states and other states. We have a twin policy at the moment of, at the same time, developing further sovereign capability, which I think is really important given the geopolitical tensions that Gerard referred to, but also to work with strategic alliances for our own capability. So from a national perspective, Australia has work to do, but I think they're doing it quite well. But I also see Australia having an important role on the global stage. We're well respected, we're a good spacefaring nation, people do listen to us, we're seen sometimes as not following the line of some of our other allies on every issue. And I think it's important for us to take a lead with other countries. New Zealand does this very well. Norway does this very well. I think Australia and Canada can also do this very well. Take a lead as, I'm not going to call us a middle power, I think that's a cliche, but take a lead and help shape the discussions with not just a nationalistic perspective, although national interest is important. But space is not just about jobs and revenues, which is, in a sense, the KPIs of some of the agencies. It's about many other things. It's about national security, it's about military, it's about diplomacy, it's about humanity. And I think Australia has a role to play. We're now forming views. We now have a stronger voice through DFAT, through the Space Agency. And I think that can and should and must continue, and together we can help shape the discussions so that we can continue with the safety, sustainability, and security and stability of space, which are all important. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you to all of our panellists. I'd like to very briefly thank the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia and our conveners, Claire McFarland and Professor Roy McLeod, for allowing us to have this conversation. It was actually a really great conversation. I wish we could continue it in person over beers, but perhaps at some point in the future we'll do so. So with that, I will hand back to Professor McLeod to thank the panelists and to give some information on further sessions. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie, very much, and thank you to all. It's been a pleasure to meet old friends and to make new ones. I'm very encouraged by what you say, not least as a historian who has written a certain amount about, if you like, the kinds of issues that Kate was beginning to mention. Certainly, we have networks among historians looking at the constellations of international law and commercial activity during the 19th century and since. And in Europe, in Africa, notably, and in the Pacific. And we have a number of good historians working on the relationship between issues which are not immediately connected, but which have similar contours. The whole history of nuclear diplomacy and diplomacy in chemical and biological weapons have resonances in much of this conversation. Countries often make decisions on the basis of what is convenient in a range of areas, all for different reasons. And I think all of this comes together extremely well in the context of what we are telling the Academy of the Social Sciences, to link this conversation much more closely within the Academy and as between the academies, because I'm anxious that the Academy of the Social Sciences should speak more closely to the Academy of Science, as well as to ASTI and the and the, well, of course, the Academy of Humanities will happily work in concert too. Now, I'm not sure to what extent any of you has had the opportunity to catch any of the earlier sessions in which we devoted an entire session to Aboriginal cosmology and thinking about the universe. An entire session to finding the profitable niche and some of the contradictions coming, especially through the work of CSIRO, questioning the intrinsic value of thinking about mining in outer space. So there's a lot of constructive thinking going on at many different levels. And it's very important for all of us to have a deep sense of what the legal context is against which all of this is operating. And for all of that, I'm extremely grateful to you. Just to advertise the next session, it will be on Monday at 10 o'clock. And we'll be bringing together a number of young people, as I said earlier, who will look at the space as they see it emerging, so to speak, from very different perspectives. And from the complexity of their lives now, here and now, asking fundamental questions to my mind, and with a selection of people who are by no means like-minded, deliberately chosen in this case to get an interesting assortment of views. So I encourage you, please, if you have time, next Monday. And then finally, next Tuesday, we'll be having this group of school children from Canberra, boys and girls, public and private schools, mixed by way of ethnic backgrounds and all the rest that I can conceive as co-efficients in our Australian community, to discuss what they see as the likelihood of Australia being an interesting and an interested party in the space conversation. And this from the point of view of 10 to 12-year-olds who are, of course, very knowledgeable. I rely upon them to work my computer all the time. I depend upon them. So I will encourage you, if you can, to come to that or to attend that, as they say, if you will, if you possibly can as well. Once again, thanks so much, Annie, for making the time. You're looking wonderful. I'm glad you're feeling better, and I'm glad, and I hope everybody keeps safe and well. Thank you again.
Thank you, Roy, and thank you everybody for coming along today and being part of this. Thank you particularly to Annie. I realise I did not do a good job of introducing Annie as the moderator. I'm sure she's well known to many of you. She's in the final stages of her PhD looking at Australian space science projects and interdisciplinary cooperation. We didn't get a chance to hear from her today, but I'm sure that once that work is out in the public, we will have the opportunity to hear a lot about what Annie's been working on. So thank you very much all for attending today, and we look forward to seeing you hopefully early next week. Thanks, bye.